Let's look at typical entrepreneur. Let's say someone has 35, they're maybe recently married. They've managed to put away a couple of $1 million and their business is making $500,000 a year. Would that be an example of a typical client that might call you?
I think I mean, it's all over the map. I mean, someone might make 500,000, they might, all the way up to $1 billion. But yeah, that's a good example.
Okay, so let's use that as a small business owner. They're doing fairly well. They're coming to you because they're maybe living in the US or Australia or Canada or wherever it may be, and they feel they're paying too much in tax. So, what is your strategy to help them minimize tax and find them a way of getting another passport? And what are the things you ask, and what types of countries would you typically recommend?
Well, I mean, we have
A lot
about
of questions in there, by the way.
yeah, we have about, I mean, 300 or 400 questions that are on the shelf that will adapt for different people that dive into different things someone could have. I mean, it really goes down to, we had someone yesterday, he's selling stuff online. Where's the warehouse? Who's putting the stuff in the boxes? Is it third party or is it in-house? I mean, it can get as detailed as that. Who's your customer service agent? Where are they located? So there's a lot of things that go in. What I look at is I talk about what I call the tax-friendly quadrant. Okay, we're not dealing with Google or Apple or Microsoft. We're dealing with small business owners who they need to personally figure out their tax plan and they need to have their business figure out a tax plan. So where are you leaving? Where are you arriving on both the personal and the business front? And so I'm generally looking at places with other tax incentives. If you're making $500,000, you're not going to go to Switzerland and pay them a $400,000 flat tax. That's not going to work. So I'm going to look at somewhere with like a tax incentive like a Portugal or a Gibraltar, or a place where they're not going to tax foreign income like a Montenegro or a Malaysia or a Thailand or a Panama or a Georgia. Or I'm going to go somewhere where you can set up it's only 5% tax or something like that, like a Malta. So there's lots of different options. But they're going to need to go and put a personal tax strategy in place to where they're not living in the United States anymore. Now they can go back and visit, but they've got to make a commitment to be somewhere else or some other places. I have my trifecta method. Maybe they choose 3 different homes. And because they're not really in any of them in a substantial enough amount, they're not going to pay in any of them. And then their company needs to leave the US, needs to leave Australia. That's going to be set up somewhere else, probably not where they're living. Very rarely makes sense to put where you're living in the company in the same place. And so if you do that, you might pay 0%, 5%. If you're an American, you can't totally escape the tax man. You might pay 10%.
Well, you
However,
can if you do what you did, I'm assuming, and relinquish your American citizenship.
And so and you mentioned second passports. That's why people sometimes get second passports. For Americans, it is either to renounce your citizenship or to have the option that whenever you please, it's just ready to go. I think for everyone else who's not American, we don't have a lot of Tanzanian clients or something who have bad passports. Most of our clients have good passports. But for everyone else, I think it's a factor of more countries are going to do this in the future, where if you're an American and you live overseas, you still have to file all the forms. You've got to report your bank accounts. You've got to tell them exactly what's happening in your Hong Kong or your UAE company. And so some people just say, you know what, I've had enough. I saw today there's a debate over, if you're an American with business in Hong Kong, how is that going to affect you because of these new sanctions going back and forth? And I say, what do you want to deal with that for? So if you give up your citizenship because you got another one, then suddenly you're free from all the U.S. rules, all the sanctions, all the restrictions, all the regulations, all the filings, all the forms.
And how difficult is it to obtain? So you mentioned a whole bunch of countries. You said Malaysia, I don't remember where else, Hong Kong. How difficult is it to obtain a passport in, let's use an example, Malaysia, for example? What do you have to do?
Very difficult. Probably marry someone and wait around for 20 years. So again, I would say,
Alternatively,
right. I would look at passports somewhere else. So Malaysia is a very open place, very pro-immigration. Pretty much anyone can come here on a tourist visa for anywhere from 30 to 90 days. You can start a business. You can get what's called an MM2H. It's currently suspended, but they'll reopen that. You put some money in the bank. They let you live here for 10 years. But you're not going to get their citizenship. So again, we're going to say, where can I get a citizenship? Number one, if you've got an ancestor, some people have like an Irish grandparent or their father was Canadian or whatever, 2-3 generations back. You can do it that way. You can also make an investment. I've done that a couple times. St. Lucia, a number of Caribbean countries do that. You give them $100,000, $150,000. They leave you alone. Here's your passport in a matter of 6 months. If you don't want to commit to living somewhere like a Portugal for 6 months, 9 months, a year, you can do what's called paper residence, where you set up a residence permit in a smaller country, generally an emerging country, and they don't really require you to be there very much to keep that residence active. And then just like any other immigrant, after 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, you can go back and say, I've been a resident, may I have my passport now? I'm applying for citizenship. And so those are generally the most common ways that people will do it. We had one guy who he had just sold a hotel business for like $150 million, and he was willing to go and invest $5 or $10 million in hotels in somewhere else. And so we found 1 or 2 European countries where the Minister of Finance was willing to negotiate and possibly recommend him for immediate citizenship by doing that, because they want people to build hotels. So there's lots of different options, but those are just some of them.
So does getting a second passport or opening and moving your head office to another country, does that necessarily mean you need to live in that other country? Or you just get a passport and then you start filing taxes somewhere else? Or what are the requirements if you're an American? What does it mean that you're giving up, for example?
Well, so if you're a U.S. citizen, they're actually not so bad. They don't really care where you are. But what they will say is if you're not paying enough tax, they have this what's called GILTI. So if you're not paying 10.5, you can pay it to us. And so there's a whole lot of qualifications. But generally, I come back to the tax-friendly quadrant. Your business and you both need to leave, and you both need to arrive somewhere. It does not need to be the same place. So we run companies in a couple different places, none of which I live in. And those countries don't require that I live there to avail myself of pretty favorable tax policies. In fact, they actually discourage you in some cases from living there. And then,
if you have, go ahead, sorry.
And then what I'm saying is if you just go and live in another place, like in Malaysia, for example, where they say, hey, we tax people who invest in our country. We tax people who are employees in our country. If you have money earned here, we tax it. We don't care who you are. Citizen, non-citizen, resident, non-resident. Anyone who makes money in Malaysia, we tax it. However, if you're making money somewhere else, we leave you alone. And so then you can start to put the pieces together where, all right, I'm not an American, so I'm allowed to leave my country's tax system. I have a company, let's say in Dubai, so they have their own restrictions, but it's not too difficult. And then I can come and live in a country that says, oh, Dubai, we don't even look at that. And that's how you start to make it work.
So you gave up your U.S. citizenship. Do people necessarily need to, if you're a Canadian American, do you need to give up your citizenship?
You're saying if you're both Canadian and American?
Well, no, if you have an American one or a Canadian one, for example, and now your clients come to you and you've facilitated the process of moving them overseas or opening up another branch location or moving their head office, do they need to necessarily give up their U.S. citizenship?
So if you're not American, you're generally not going to. Certain people who are like Chinese, for example, you're not allowed to have dual citizenship. If you want to be honest about getting another passport, maybe you give up your Chinese one. But by and large, everyone who's coming to me who's from anywhere but the U.S., I may be convincing them to invest in some kind of insurance policy, because you've seen in Canada, there was a member of parliament who now says, we want to have this U.S. tax system where no matter where you live, if you're Canadian, you pay. And so if you're a Canadian, you think, hey, that's the direction this country's going. Let me get one now. Let me just get started. Maybe it'll be cheaper if I get it started earlier. And that's my insurance policy. If they do it, I'll decide what to do then. If I'm an American, I have some people who are doing cryptocurrency investing. They're doing day trading. They have a lot of capital gains. There's not a lot that they can do short of, let's say, moving to Puerto Rico, which they may not want to do. So they may just choose to expatriate. I don't always recommend it. I don't encourage everyone to follow in my footsteps, because it is a difficult decision. I have been overseas for a number of years before I decided I don't need to do this. I had almost never come back to the U.S. I made a point to avoid it. And again, I never really liked living in the U.S. I never really felt comfortable being an American or being part of the culture. And so for me, it was easier. But it certainly does make your life easier. And they're making the rules more difficult. Now I see Joe Biden wants to make it even more difficult. So it certainly makes your life easier.
Right. Good. One last question. So I asked you earlier, typical small business, $2 million in wealth. They're making $500,000, maybe $1 million a year in taxes. How much could someone like that save if they were to come to you, and what would it look like from a financial perspective?
Yeah, so I mean, my goal is to generally, I mean, as low as someone's willing to go. There's a couple of factors that matter. So again, if you're an American, there's possible to pay zero. Let's say, for example, you're an American, but you're like me. I actually am 35 and recently married. My spouse is not a U.S. citizen. They didn't live in the U.S. I wouldn't have wanted to. And so if I were still a U.S. citizen and I were married today, we could own a business together, and I'd have a better position to be paying pretty close to zero. If you want to live in a place like Puerto Rico, you might be paying about 4%. If you want to go offshore, you're probably going to be paying a little bit more than that. For everybody else, you can pay as much or as little as you want. If you're a Canadian and you want to move, and live the life that I've done, you could pay zero. The other caveat is some people, they like to move to Europe. There are countries in Europe where they'll say, hey, for 5 years or 10 years or 18 years, don't pay any tax to us. But we don't like Dubai companies, for example. That's like on our gray list. That's on our black list. We don't like those. So you have to have a company in one of our approved jurisdictions. And that jurisdiction might charge you 5%, for example. And so you might have to pay 5% in order for the privilege of living in Europe under one of their tax exemptions. So you get to decide what you pay. There is a path for most people to zero.
The places you've lived, which countries have you liked the most?
Well, I think we all vote with our feet. So I live in Malaysia. I have a home here, buying a bigger home. I like, as kind of an up-and-coming place, the country of Georgia. I like on the seaside, more old-school place, Montenegro. It's just kind of a relaxed place versus Western Europe. I think actually Colombia is a very interesting up-and-coming case study. I don't think it's a great place to spend the whole year, but I think it's a good place to be. I think Mexico City is one of the best cities on earth. And so what I practice is basically my global citizen sandwich. I live in places that are in the middle, like Kuala Lumpur. I then invest in more up-and-coming places like Cambodia, but then I keep wealth in a place like Singapore, which is more solid than anywhere else in Southeast Asia. So I like places that are developed, that are hidden gems, that are not dirt cheap or dirt roads kind of thing, but that are kind of off the radar.
When you say you keep wealth, does that mean you have a bank account? Does it mean you're buying real estate, or a little bit of both?
Yeah, I'm generally not buying real estate in hyper developed markets. Singapore, I don't think, is an issue on a regulatory standpoint. If you look at most EU markets, I just saw today, now Budapest is going to ban Airbnb, it seems. And so, any attempt to make yield in Europe, they shut that right down. That's why I wouldn't invest in it. So many requirements, taxes, etc. But yeah, I mean, for example, I've invested in Cambodia real estate for years. Yields are pretty good. Appreciation's good. It's had a 25-year track record of no recession. So I'm going to invest there, and I enjoy visiting, but I wouldn't live there. Singapore, on the other hand, I mean, I'm not going to spend $2 million to live in a shoebox. It's just not worth it for me. I can choose where I want to live. And so I will park money there. Maybe I'll do some stocks or some bonds or some REITs, and I'll have a great relationship manager or two to manage those assets. But yeah, I don't want to buy real estate at 1% yield.
Right. Good. All right, Andrew. So that is the end of the podcast. Thank you so much for your time. Why don't you tell everybody where they can find you?
So you can find us a lot of places. You can find us on nomadcapitalist.com. We've written almost 2,000 articles over the last 7 years. You can find us on YouTube. Just type in Nomad Capitalist. You can find our book, Nomad Capitalist, on Amazon, which is a good 270-some page primer on what you can and can't do and what the opportunities are. And I'd say those are the best places to start.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time, and it was a pleasure speaking to you.
Hey, great to be with you. How can Nomad Capitalist help you? 4 ways. Number 1, subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell to make sure you get our new video every day. Number 2, get a copy of Nomad Capitalist, the book. You'll learn a lot of my personal experiences over a dozen years of studying this stuff, as well as exactly some of the strategies that you can use to build your Nomad Capitalist plan. Number 3, if you're not sure where to start, but you want to come and learn from my team and I, you want to come and mingle with like-minded people, learn more about our live conference, Nomad Capitalist Live. It's coming up soon. And number 4, if you want some help right now because you've got a burning issue, you need something solved, you want to lower your taxes, get a second passport, or build the Nomad Capitalist lifestyle of your dreams, go to nomadcapitalist.com and click on Become a Client.